The Age of Discovery is an informal and loosely defined European historical period from the 15th century to the 18th century, marking the time in which extensive overseas exploration emerged as a powerful factor in European culture and globalization. Many lands previously unknown to Europeans were discovered during this period, though most were already inhabited, and from the perspective of many non-Europeans it marked the arrival of settlers and invaders from a previously unknown continent. Global exploration started with the Portuguese discoveries of the Atlantic archipelagos of Madeira and the Azores, the coast of Africa, and the discovery of the sea route to India in 1498, and, on behalf of the Crown of Castile, the transatlantic voyages of Christopher Columbus between 1492 and 1502, and the first circumnavigation of the globe in 1519 to 1522. These discoveries led to numerous naval expeditions across the Atlantic, Indian and Pacific Oceans, and land expeditions in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Australia that continued into the late 19th century, and ended with the exploration of the polar regions in the 20th century. European overseas exploration led to the rise of global trade and the European colonial empires, with the contact between the Old World and the New World producing the Columbian Exchange, a wide transfer of plants, animals, food, human populations, communicable diseases and culture between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. This represented one of the most significant global events concerning ecology, agriculture, and culture in history. The Age of Discovery and later European exploration allowed the global mapping of the world, resulting in a new world view and distant civilizations coming into contact, but also led to the propagation of diseases that decimated populations not previously in contact with Eurasia and Africa, and to the enslavement, exploitation, military conquest, and economic dominance of Europe and its colonies over native populations. It also allowed for the expansion of Christianity throughout the world, becoming the world's largest religion. Overview. The Portuguese began systematically exploring the Atlantic coast of Africa from 1418, under the sponsorship of Prince Henry. Under Henry's direction, a new and much lighter ship was developed, the caravel, which could sail further and faster, and, above all, was highly maneuverable and could sail much nearer the wind, or into the wind. In 1488 Bartholomew Diaz reached the Indian Ocean by this route. In 1492 the Catholic monarchs of Castile and Aragon funded Christopher Columbus's plan to sail west to reach the Indies by crossing the Atlantic. He landed on a continent uncharted by Europeans and seen as a new world, the Americas. To prevent conflict between Portugal and Castile, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, dividing the world into two regions of exploration, where each had exclusive rights to claim newly discovered lands. In 1498, a Portuguese expedition commanded by Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa, opening up direct trade with Asia, while other exploratory fleets were sent from Portugal to northern North America. In the following years, Portuguese India armadas also extended this eastern oceanic route to the New World, touching sometimes South America en route to Asia, and explored islands in the South Atlantic and Southern Indian Oceans. Soon, the Portuguese sailed further eastward to the valuable Spice Islands in 1512, landing in China 1 year later. In 1513, Spanish Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and reached the other sea from the New World. Thus, Europe first received news of the eastern and western Pacific within a 1-year span around 1512. East and West exploration overlapped in 1522, when a Castilian expedition, led by Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan and later by Spanish Basque navigator Juan Sebastián Elcano, sailing westward, completed the first circumnavigation of the world, while Spanish conquistadors explored the inland of the Americas, and later, some of the South Pacific islands. Since 1495, the French and English and, much later, the Dutch entered the race of exploration after learning of these exploits, defying the Iberian monopoly on maritime trade by searching for new routes, first to the western coasts of North and South America, through the first English and French expeditions, and into the Pacific Ocean around South America, but eventually by following the Portuguese around Africa into the Indian Ocean, discovering Australia in 1606, New Zealand in 1642, and Hawaii in 1778. Meanwhile, from the 1580s to the 1640s, Russians explored and conquered almost the whole of Siberia and Alaska in the 1730s. Background: European medieval knowledge about Asia beyond the reach of the Byzantine Empire was sourced in partial reports, often obscured by legends, dating back from the time of the conquests of Alexander the Great and his successors. Another source was the Radnite Jewish trade networks of merchants established as go-betweens between Europe and the Muslim world during the time of the Crusader states. In 1154, the Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi created a description of the world and a world map, the Tabula Rogeriana, at the court of King Roger II of Sicily, but still Africa was only partially known to either Christians, Genoese and Venetians, or the Arab seamen, and its southern extent unknown. There were reports of Great African Sahara, but the factual knowledge was limited for the Europeans to the Mediterranean coasts and little else, since the Arab blockade of North Africa precluded exploration inland. Knowledge about the Atlantic African coast was fragmented and derived mainly from Old Greek and Roman maps based on Carthaginian knowledge, including the time of Roman exploration of Mauritania. The Red Sea was barely known, and only trade links with the maritime republics, the Republic of Venice especially, fostered collection of accurate maritime knowledge. Indian Ocean trade routes were sailed by Arab traders. Between 1405 and 1421, the Yongle Emperor of Ming China sponsored a series of long-range tributary missions under the command of Shang He. The fleets visited Arabia, East Africa, India, maritime Southeast Asia and Thailand. But the journeys, reported by Marwan, a Muslim voyager and translator, were halted abruptly after the emperor's death and were not followed up. As the Chinese Ming dynasty retreated in the Heijin, a policy of isolationism, having limited maritime trade. By 1400, a Latin translation of Ptolemy's Geographia reached Italy coming from Constantinople. The rediscovery of Roman geographical knowledge was a revelation, both for map-making and worldview. Although reinforcing the idea that the Indian Ocean was landlocked, medieval travel, a prelude to the Age of Discovery, was a series of European expeditions crossing Eurasia by land in the late Middle Ages. Although the Mongols had threatened Europe with pillage and destruction, Mongol states also unified much of Eurasia and, from 1206 on, the Pax Mongolica allowed safe trade routes and communication lines stretching from the Middle East to China. A series of Europeans took advantage of these to explore eastwards. Most were Italians, as trade between Europe and the Middle East was controlled mainly by the maritime republics. The close Italian links to the Levant raised great curiosity and commercial interest in countries which lay further east. Christian embassies were sent as far as Karakoram during the Mongol invasions of Syria, from which they gained a greater understanding of the world. The first of these travelers was Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, dispatched by Pope Innocent IV to the Great Khan, who journeyed to Mongolia and back from 1241 to 1247. About the same time, Russian Prince Yaroslav of Vladimir, and subsequently his sons Alexander Nevsky and Andrei II of Vladimir, traveled to the Mongolian capital. Though having strong political implications, their journeys left no detailed accounts. Other travelers followed, like French André de Longuemeau and Flemish William of Rubruck, who reached China through Central Asia. Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant, dictated an account of journeys throughout Asia from 1271 to 1295, describing being a guest at the Yuan dynasty court of Kublai Khan in travels, and it was read throughout Europe. In 1291, in a first Atlantic exploration attempt, merchant brothers Vadino and Ugolino Vivaldi sailed from Genoa with 2 galleys but disappeared off the Moroccan coast, feeding the fears of oceanic travel. From 1325 to 1354, a Moroccan scholar from Tangier, Ibn Battuta, journeyed through North Africa, the Sahara Desert, West Africa, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East and Asia. Having reached China, after returning, he dictated an account of his journeys to a scholar he met in Granada, the Rilla, the unheralded source on his adventures. Between 1357 and 1371, a book of supposed travels compiled by John Mandeville acquired extraordinary popularity, despite the unreliable and often fantastical nature of its accounts. It was used as a reference for the East, Egypt, and the Levant in general, asserting the old belief that Jerusalem was the center of the world. Following the period of Timurid relations with Europe, in 1439 Niccolo da Conti published an account of his travels as a Muslim merchant to India and Southeast Asia, and later in 1466 to 1472, Russian merchant Afanasy Nikitin of Tver traveled to India, which he described in his book A Journey Beyond the Three Seas. These overland journeys had little immediate effect. The Mongol Empire collapsed almost as quickly as it formed, and soon the route to the east became more difficult and dangerous. The Black Death of the 14th century also blocked travel and trade. The rise of the Ottoman Empire further limited the possibilities of European overland trade. Chinese missions. The Chinese had wide connections through trade in Asia and had been sailing to Arabia, East Africa, and Egypt since the Tang dynasty. Between 1405 and 1421, the third Ming Emperor Yongle sponsored a series of long-range tributary missions in the Indian Ocean under the command of Admiral Zhang He. A large fleet of new junk ships was prepared for these international diplomatic expeditions. The largest of these junks, that the Chinese termed Baoshuan, may have measured 121 meters stem to stern, and thousands of sailors were involved. The first expedition departed in 1405. At least 7 well-documented expeditions were launched, each bigger and more expensive than the last. The fleets visited Arabia, East Africa, India, Malay Archipelago and Thailand, exchanging goods along the way. They presented gifts of gold, silver, porcelain and silk. In return, received such novelties as ostriches, zebras, camels, ivory and giraffes. After the emperor's death, Zhang He led a final expedition departing from Nanking in 1431 and returning to Beijing in 1433. It is very likely that this last expedition reached as far as Madagascar. The travels were reported by Marwan, a Muslim voyager and translator who accompanied Zheng He on 3 of the 7 expeditions. His account published as Ying Ye Zheng Lam. These long-distance journeys were not followed up, as the Chinese Ming dynasty retreated in the Heijin, a policy of isolationism. Having limited maritime trade. Travels were halted abruptly after the emperor's death, as the Chinese lost interest in what they termed barbarian lands, turning inward. Unsuccessor emperors felt the expeditions were harmful to the Chinese state. Hongxi Emperor ended further expeditions, and Shand Emperor suppressed much of the information about Zheng He's voyages.